Crazy to think that I'm holding the Holy Trinity of vampire books. These are all of the vampire books I own. If you're like me and you love vampires and reading, you've come to the right place because today we are going to be talking about vampire literature and the 3 classic books that influenced the whole vampire genre. Dracula by Bram Stoker is probably the most famous novel of its kind, but it wasn't the first of its genre. If you think Carmilla by Sheridan Fanu was the actual first book of its kind, you're wrong. But Bram Stoker did take some inspiration from this. The first actual vampire book was The Vampyre by John Polidori, and this is the book that started it all. So, how did John Polidori write The Vampyre? In the very rainy summer of 1816, John Polidori, along Lord Byron and Mary Shelley, were together in a gorgeous villa. And Lord Byron had the marvelous idea of the 3 making ghost stories. And so, in that time, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. John Polidori decided to tell a story and was laughed at by Lord Byron. So, what did John Polidori do after he was laughed at? He took this blood-sucking monster and transformed him into an aristocrat that had similar behavior as Lord Byron had. And after the book was released, Byron openly criticized John Polidori's book and writing and mocked his ideas. So, The Vampyre by John Polidori is, if you want, the godfather of vampire literature. Moving on, we have Carmilla by Sheridan Fanu, and it was written in 1872. Fanu lived in the Victorian era when the society was anxious about women being independent, death, and people's sexualities. And Fanu was influenced by European folklore and vampires. The story is told by Laura, a young woman who lives in Austria with her father. And one night, a mysterious carriage crashes in their home, and a beautiful woman named Carmilla is injured. So the daughter and the father took her in and tried to get her back to health. And as Laura and Carmilla spend time together, they form a relationship. And the similarity between Carmilla and Dracula is that as Laura spends time with Carmilla, Laura begins to grow sicker, paler, weaker, because, Carmilla was drinking her blood and stuff. And the same thing happens in Dracula, where Lucy Westerna grows sicker and paler as time passes because Dracula was feeding on her. And that led to Van Helsing having to perform multiple blood transfusions that in the end failed, and Lucy became a vampire. And now we've come to the start of the show, Dracula by Bram Stoker. So Bram Stoker began working on Dracula in 1890, and he was deeply influenced by folklore, history, other literature, and his own imagination. Bram Stoker used Vlad Tepes as a minor historical figure, not true inspiration for the character Count Dracula. And please stop saying that Vlad Tepes was a vampire. He wasn't a vampire, nor he was drinking blood. Yes, he was impaling people and was ruthless, but that does not make him a vampire. And another huge mistake that people make is that Dracula and Mina were in a romantic relationship. In the movies, yeah, they were. But in the book, Mina was terrified by Dracula and disgusted by him. Dracula only wanted Mina to take revenge on Jonathan Harker, because Jonathan Harker ruined Dracula's plans of him blending into London and being able to create his own vampires and drinking as much blood as he wants. And now that we cleared that up, let's go back to how Bram Stoker wrote Dracula. So he did a lot of research on Eastern European legends, especially from Transylvania, Hungary, and the Balkans. And he was fascinated by superstitions about the undead. So these are the 3 classic vampire books that inspired the modern vampire culture. These days, you can read vampire novels about probably anything and everything. Vampire romance, spooky vampires with curses, Lucy's retelling. My favorite retelling, A Diary of Blood. It follows the brides of Dracula and they eventually kill him. And this is probably my favorite vampire book. And of course the Twilight Saga, which is just, part of the pop culture now. So a mistake I did a few years ago while I was getting into vampire literature and vampire books and vampire culture is that I didn't read Dracula before reading all the other vampire books. And I've recently read Dracula, and now a lot of the vampire books that I read, such as A Diary of Blood, make much more sense. So my advice before getting into vampire books is reading Dracula, because it really helps you understand more. And of course, if you want to go back to the beginning, to the origins, The Vampire by John Polidori. And it's a very short story. You can read it in like 1 hour. You can find an audiobook on YouTube that's less than an hour. So I think it's really worth it. Thank you for watching this video, and I will see you next time.